Look now at the kind of end of the Meiji Era, and this is an important time for us on paper 3 really, because it's taking us through the kind of rise of Japan, like kind of from the Meiji light really into the kind of Taisho era of 1912 onwards, which is generally regarded as a more sluggish time for Japan after its rapid and incredible development after 1868. Remember, the Taisho emperor was not a very sharp intellect, and we then will we go back into a different time period, but we're really focusing on now the kind of end of the Meiji period, and probably the episode that kind of gets Japan noticed on a world scene much more than anything else is, of course, the victory in the Russo-Japanese War, far more so than the Sino-Japanese War, which of course is surprising. Most people expected China to win that one, despite China's huge size and huge armies. That it was generally expected that, even though Japanese had advanced so much in this time period, that China would still prevail. That, of course, as we know, wasn't the case. But by 1904, Japan has moved on to different sites. In 1903, there's a conference in Murin-an in Kyoto in Japan between Yamagata Oritomo, Ito Hirobumi is there, and they begin to set the path for a new Japanese foreign policy, a more assertive foreign policy. Remember that one of the consequences of the Sino-Japanese War was the Japanese occupation of Korea. And there had been increasing problems with Russia moving into the Manchurian region, that very resource, coal-rich area of China that really everybody is kind of looking at very closely. Even the Europeans down in their treaty ports are looking at expansion by both Russia and Japan into Manchuria. Railways are being built, coal mines are being exploited, those types of things. So Russia moves in 1904 to annex Manchuria, and really this is the beginning now of a series of tensions, and certainly Russia does play a significant part in contributing to the outbreak of the war. And personally I would suggest that it wasn't necessarily planned by the Japanese to happen as, when and how it did, but certainly it was something that the Japanese had been considering in order to sort of cement their control of the Korean peninsula and of course guarantee and protect their interests in Manchuria. Now, Japan does try to sort of negotiate its way out of it. As you can see from that second bullet point, Japan kind of offers an opportunity, like, we'll have Korea, you have Manchuria, and let's kind of leave each other alone in the middle. But there was definitely an element of Russian arrogance here and of kind of Russian pretensions to greatness. Remember, Russia has had a disastrous end to the 19th century and is really itself looking for opportunities to bring itself back onto the international scene. And really the Russians dismiss Japanese attempts to negotiate. There's high levels of racism from Nicholas II and also Plefa, his interior minister. So certainly those attitudes, those racist attitudes from the leaders of Russia, put together with Russia's own internal needs to kind of assert itself, is almost enough to kind of trigger the situation. Russia basically behaves so badly that Japan is kind of left with no choice in order to avoid national humiliation, other than to go to war. So the Russians engineer a situation by which Japan actually attacks first. This is kind of good for the Russian reputation. They're the victims of the Japanese assault. But it's stunning how quickly and how modernized and how industrialized the Japanese are, and they take the Russians by surprise. The Russians perhaps have put too much confidence in their brand new Trans-Siberian Railway. It certainly doesn't live up to expectations in terms of transporting soldiers across Russia to fight where they're needed. And it's a kind of catalogue of disaster for Russia, one thing after the other. But as we've seen frequently, and you thinking back to other times when you've got kind of small countries taking on masses of opposition, if you think back to perhaps some of the Arab-Israeli conflicts as well, Japan is pushed to the limits. Okay, Russia itself will go through an attempted revolution in 1905, and one of the causal factors is the strain of the Russo-Japanese War. And Japan itself also, despite its tremendous successes, is really kind of on the ropes, and the war can't really be sustained much longer. Excuse me, Teddy Roosevelt, who's in the middle of that cartoon there, the US president at the time, proposes mediation, and we have now the beginning of this idea of international mediation. So the Russo-Japanese War sets a lot of international precedents for us, and one of those is that, you know, an outsider third party can mediate between two parties that are squabbling or arguing. And so it's signed in Portsmouth in the USA, and in 1905 Japan gets Port Arthur and gets recognition of its kind of position in Korea. There isn't too much kind of historiography on here, and this is actually a kind of current source from the time. But I think, though, you know, this is very optimistic, written in a news article at the time. I think afterwards, though, and particularly as the news kind of gets home to Japan, there are some serious protests. Russia gets off pretty lightly. I mean, they've been roundly defeated, and they evacuate Manchuria, which they'd only just got, so it's no sort of skin off their nose, as we say. It's no real big loss. But Russia is now humiliated everywhere. They've kind of failed in the Crimea in the 1850s, and they've now kind of failed with their sort of South Asian expansion in places like Afghanistan. They failed in kind of northeastern China now, and so Russia kind of will sort of turn itself back and begin to have a look again at Europe, which of course will have consequences as the First World War begins to start. But Japan itself is kind of on the rise, and there's a huge surge in nationalism. Here's a commemorative postcard from the Treaty of Portsmouth there, with the different representatives of the different sides. The reaction in Japan is of utter disappointment and feeling let down, and we're going to see it again, and of course those of you who looked at the causes of World War II in Asia will also see that this is another response and another contributing factor. Japan feels like it should have got more, it deserved more, and that there's incredible disappointment and resentment from this sort of nationalist fervour, and there are riots, and it really is genuinely unpopular. Many Japanese people kind of feel betrayed by the politicians that negotiated the peace treaty. So as we move into the end of this era, there's the story of General Nogi. He is a classic Meiji figure at this time. He's the leader of the army, and he goes on to run one of the schools. He actually is a tutor of the later Emperor Hirohito. And Nogi kind of symbolises a lot of those kind of aspects of the Meiji era. With the death of the Emperor Meiji, Nogi and his wife commit ritual suicide, and so they symbolise it, and in comes this rather weak-minded Emperor Taisho. So it's the end of an era, really, for Japan at this time, and the transition certainly into the First World War era in 1920s in Japan will be particularly painful for Japan and its neighbours. So in terms of where you're going on paper 3 for this question, you might want to have a look and think about what types of essay questions you can be asked about this particular time period. Probably you'll have to have a look at the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War together, and have a look at the sort of foreign policy implications, the sort of decisions being made at this time, and that would probably be related to kind of modernisation. Who modernises Japan after 1868? Really, what does Emperor Meiji actually do? And I think that's a question that you kind of need to ask yourself. You need to be able to identify the key figures of the Genro, those oligarchs, people like Ito Hirobumi, and so on, and there's a list of them at the bottom there for you to have a look through. And also that kind of beginning now, this kind of sort of super business, the Zaibatsu as well, so it's worth having a look at those. In terms of changes in Japan, how the Japanese economy is reorganised under the Meiji. Remember, we had that shift to kind of government control and eventually private control. What big societal changes happen, and also what happens with the military. I just noticed that's spelt wrong, so excuse me there. Japan's foreign policy we've covered already, and the key ideas, and I think probably that top bullet point there is one of the key things that you need to grapple with, and it's certainly something that the historians also are looking at, is is it a revolution or is it a restoration? So you kind of need to unpick and unravel your way through that. So thanks for listening.